I want to introduce our speaker this evening. I'll try to be brief, but it's really hard because of how much work he has done and how much research, how much publication, how many presentations. So it'll be a bit of a challenge, but I've invented a new way to do it. So if you'll prepare yourself, Tom. Okay, are you ready? Okay. Um, Tom Levy is the Norma Kershaw Chair in the Archaeology of Ancient Israel and Neighboring Lands at the University of California, San Diego. Now, that position are they in search for a replacement for you? That job hunts are happening? So in a kind of traditional way of introducing people, he got his PhD at the University of Sheffield in England, in the UK, in 1981. But I'm going to deviate from the normal way. I think one of the best ways to capture Tom's academic life is to read through a table of contents. I'm not going to read it through, and it's not, table of contents do not develop plot, and there's no character development. There's nothing like that. But in a recent book, a volume that was just published, 2023, a festschrift in Tom's honor for his innovative techniques and approaches to archaeology in the southern Levant, in several countries. And the name of the book is An In Length of Days Understanding, which is a quote from the book of Job 12:12. And the subtitle, Essays on Archaeology in the Eastern Mediterranean and Beyond, in honor of Thomas E. Levy. And I want to say a couple things about that book. I want to go through a couple things in the table of contents, but first of all, some data. This book is not one book, it's two books, and it's 1,950 pages. So already that says something about the people who respect Tom Levy and work with him. I'm reminded of that because the article that my colleague Suzanne Richard and I did together starts on page 1,701. I don't know that I've ever had an article that high in page numbers. There were 139 contributors to this volume, which again says something about the influence that Tom has had with a lot of people in a lot of disciplines. You can buy it. You can go on Amazon and you can buy it for $449.99. Don't forget the cents, okay? And you're not getting any of that. So, and a couple of other quick comments about Tom, I think from the book, but also from personal experience. He has been able to combine archaeology in Israel, Jordan, and the northern Mediterranean. He has been able to work across lines of anthropology, archaeology, and biblical studies. He does dirt archaeology, metallurgy, and maritime archaeology. He actually moved from the dirt archaeology to water a few years ago, and that's where he's working now. Contributor interests. Okay, this is from the table of contents. Prehistory, animal husbandry, burials, Neolithic subsistence. These are titles by the authors who are writing them in honor of Tom. Okay. Chalcolithic sites, flints, pottery production, theoretical, methodological considerations, state formation in the Iron Age architecture, agriculture, economic changes over time, typology, chronology, cyber archaeology is something that will always be identified with Tom Levy, and that is making the broadest use of digital recording and location devices possible. And Tom is the one who facilitated that, and a lot of us do that at this point. Archaeometallurgy, cultural heritage. I think the place that you may be remembered best for, Tom, in terms of geography is the Wadi Fainan, where you spent 20 years at 20 different sites, and probably the most significant, you may want to address this in your comment, has to do with metallurgy, has to do with the harvesting and smelting of copper ore. A massive operation that was undertaken there. And then a couple more things I want to say. Your involvement with CNEA, with our Archaeology Center. We have and are processing the 130 or so boxes of your research library. And we could not be more proud or more happy. We're also processing, almost as we speak, certainly yesterday, almost at this time, a massive collection of research materials from these 20 years of excavations in and around the Wadi Fainan. That was gifted to us by you, Tom. Thank you. Tom has also been instrumental in referring lots of people to us with their libraries. And so we now have, we've come to the full point. We've had to stop accepting donations, but you have been the conduit for a number of these people with their libraries. So we want to thank you for that. A couple of instructions, some rules. We will have time for Q&A. Use the microphone. We will bring it to you. Thank you. For people especially who are with us. The presentation this evening is called A Desert Chiefdom and the Metal Revolution, 4500 to 3600 BCE, New Insights from the Negev Desert in Israel. Dr. Tom Levy, please.
Thank you so much, Doug. And it's really wonderful to be back at La Sierra. I think I was here about 8 years ago, and I don't believe this building was here, and it's beautiful. Wow. I think the only thing missing is an archaeology museum building. So let's make that happen. That's important. So happy Valentine's Day to everybody. And I want to thank Doug Clark and Larry Garrity, especially for the invitation to speak here this evening. And what you do here is so important. And I'm not going to talk about digital archaeology tonight. Every archaeologist has an albatross or two that hangs over their head of old excavation projects that they need to publish. So I published Shikmim 1. I'm going to talk about this Chalcolithic site in Israel's northern Negev desert tonight. The first volume came out in 1987. The second volume came out in October. And I just want to give this to you, to the library, if you'll take it. But I think you have to add a library to this building you guys are putting together. So a number of people asked me this evening, well, when was the last time you were in Israel? I landed in Israel on October 7th last year, the day that 3,000 Hamas terrorists invaded the country. Today is day 131 of the war, and we hope that it's going to end sooner than later. I picked up my rental car and was driving through Tel Aviv at about 7:30, and there was a rocket attack. I thought there was a lot of traffic like you got here on the 5. But no, it was different. It took me a while to understand that. Okay, but that's the last time, and I hope we can go back sooner. I hope in May we're going to have resume our underwater archaeology work that we were slated to do. I just want to give a call out to Professor Garrity. This connection with the Seventh-day Adventist community, it goes back with me, and I like to call you folks my Seventh-day brothers and sisters. And in 2013, I think it was, 2013, Larry came to UCSD with Brad Sparks with the idea of doing a international conference on the Exodus. And they had just been at UCLA. And I said, why didn't UCLA do it? And they said, well, politics, trying to get a conference at a major American academic research institution. It's about religion and the Bible. It's a challenge, okay? But Larry said, we want to have 50 people, and we want to have it for 4 days. So you know what I said? I said, show me the money. Remember that movie? And well, he pulled out a paper and it showed that they had a lot of money. So I went upstairs at the Qualcomm Institute at UCSD, came back 10 minutes later, we organized it. And it was awesome. And we published it with Springer, the same people that did the Feshrift, this big peer-reviewed book on Israel's Exodus in transdisciplinary perspective. And I'm so honored that you mentioned the Feshrift, because in November at the ASOR meetings in Chicago, they presented it to me and my friends like Doug and Sten LaBianca. Do you know Sten? He and Larry was there. So it was a wonderful celebration. And here you can see one of the truckloads of material Doug mentioned. We donated 35 tons of artifacts from Jordan to La Sierra University. And Sean is here. Where's Sean? There he is back there. I think you've carried all of it, right? Yeah, with one hand. It was amazing. But there's a lot of good stuff there, and this was all given with my colleague, Dr. Mohammed Najjar, who I worked with in Jordan for 20 years, and I still publish with Mohammed. And this is one of the 7 trucks that Doug drove from UCSD up to La Sierra loaded with those artifacts. So that's the background. But tonight we're talking about something that's very near to my heart, the Chalcolithic period. It's the first professional research I did in the Holy Land. And in fact, I published an article in Biblical Archaeologist that when Larry was the editor-in-chief of that thing, and that was a great venue for me as a young scholar. So think about metal. The beginnings of metallurgy begin in the southern Levant, that is Israel, Jordan, the Palestinian areas, Lebanon, and southern Syria and the Sinai. It begins around 4,500 to 3,600 BC in our region. And that's about the dates, 6,000 years ago around the old world when people first discovered how to smelt copper, how to extract copper metal from ore. But just think of a world without metal and without copper. Where would we be? You could not have one of these without copper, one of these cell phones and so on. So it's very important. And so one of the hearth areas for this was in the northern Negev desert of Israel, and I'll show you where that is in a moment. So in this lecture, I want to try to touch on 3 topics. This first technological revolution in world history, metallurgy, and in our area, in the Holy Land, and then understand how that relates to the emergence of social inequality. For the first time, it goes together in the old world. And then I'll finish with what we could call action archaeology. And that is sort of reconstructing how people mined, transported, and smelted copper. And we did an experiment with the National Geographic Society where we schlepped the copper ore from Jordan across the border between Jordan and Israel, about 150 kilometers, using donkeys. Okay, so that's, I love donkeys. Here's a rough timeline for you. This is, let's start with the Neolithic period, but prior to that, we have over 1 million years of hunting and gathering societies. And then sometime, in the Neolithic period, you get the domestication of plants and animals. And at the end of that, around 6,000 years ago, you get the Chalcolithic period with the first evidence of metallurgy. And then you get, after that, after the Chalcolithic, early Bronze Age, you get the origins of the first cities in our region. And then by the Iron Age, you're well into the biblical period, the period of the settlement of the tribes in the land, to the Babylonian conquest around 586 BC. And that's basically our timeline. So what is the Chalcolithic period? I explained, well, let's just look at the words. The Greek chalkos means copper, and lithos is stone. So we're still dealing with kind of a stone age, still a lot of stone tools, but we have the introduction of copper. It was discovered first around the northern end of the Dead Sea in what is modern Jordan in the 1920s. And again, this is the beginnings of social inequality, and you'll see what that means momentarily. The one who discovered it was a priest, a Catholic priest, Père Alexis Malone, that you see here on the left. And in the late 20s and the 1930s, he excavated the site called Tleilat Gasul. Have any of you been there in Jordan? Yep, I see a few. Amazing site. He thought, the site was covered with, 10 or 20 feet of ash in many places. He thought he found the site of Gomorrah from the Bible. He brought his material back to the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Jerusalem, put it out on the tables, and invited the director of the American School of Oriental Research at the time, William Foxwell Albright, that many of you are familiar with. In fact, the place is now called the Albright Institute in Jerusalem. Albright was a genius. He looked at the material and he saw these copper fish hooks, he saw ore, and he said to Per Malone, you know what, you discovered a new period. Let's call it the Chalcolithic period. And that's how it all started. Well, I think as archaeologists, it really helps to always have a model of culture, because we're trying to reconstruct these ancient cultures. And so this is the model I like, where, you know, culture is made up of social organization, technology, subsistence, economy or trade and exchange, and religion. And all societies through time have these attributes. And so we can, you know, depending on the luck of the draw, you might find a temple site. And so if you discover a temple, well, you can approach the archaeological record through the archaeology of cult, or maybe technology, like in our case with the Copper Age and sites in southern Jordan, in Fainan. We can look at the archaeological record through the lens of technology. And then we want to study how do these cultural systems adapt to other cultures and environments, and those situations change through time, through environmental change and cultural change. Okay, where are we working? We're going to talk about the northern Negev, which is right over here. I mentioned the southern Levant. This is it in the southeast Mediterranean. And here I've just highlighted the three main copper ore resource zones in the southern Levant. The largest one is in southern Jordan, where I worked with Dr. Najjar in Fainan. 105 kilometers to the south is another big one called Timna, and that's where most recently Professor Erez Ben Yosef of Tel Aviv University works. He's the editor of that Feshrep. He was my student. Very proud of him. And he does similar work as to what we did in Fainan. And then another region of copper is in southern Sinai at Bir Nasib that you see outlined there. There are other deposits of copper throughout ancient Midian, which is over here in northwest Arabia, the Hijaz, and it goes through there. The area, here's a close-up view, and we'll come to this map at the end of the lecture again, where it shows this is the Fainan region, and these arrows show the donkey train that we took all the way from Fainan to Shikmim up there, and now you have the book. And what we see are clusters on this map of centers of Chalcolithic occupation on different wadis, you know, different drainages. Like this is the Beersheba Valley, where most of the sites are located, and then there are other ones as we go further north. In fact, you could say the first population explosion in the southern Levant happens in the Chalcolithic period, and we'll look at that. And my work on the Chalcolithic was always carried out with David Alon, who was a kibbutznik who later worked with the Israel Antiquities Authority. And so you can see David there on the left, and a young Tom Levy over there. And another one of the founders of Chalcolithic research in the southern Levant was a French prehistorian by the name of Jean Perrot, who you see here. And we'll come back to him because in the 1950s, David, who did surveys on the weekends, you know, near his kibbutz, he found the first Chalcolithic sites in the Beersheba Valley, told Jean Perrot about it, and so Jean Perrot started his excavations at Abu Matar and Bir Safadi, two really famous Chalcolithic sites. So my contention is that the first chiefdoms, the first complex societies, hierarchical societies, evolved during the Chalcolithic period. And that's been a point of debate with other archaeologists and lots of articles and books. But this is my position, that the way we can explain what's happening in the Chalcolithic is by seeing it as the rise of these chiefdoms. And chiefdoms are organized on two economic principles. Staple finance, that is the chiefly families or whatever, they can control the storage of food, staple goods, and so on, and then they can redistribute it. Or another model is what you call wealth finance. These are ideas from an anthropologist by the name of Tim Earle. And this idea is that by controlling craft production, chiefs could give away gifts, and those would create a situation of like social debt. So it's kind of like if I gave you a Mercedes, you would owe me. You know, when I said, you know, Larry, we need to do something on the Wadi, it's time to pay me back, and you would do it because we had this social relationship of debt. Okay, so that's how Chalcolithic, that's how chiefdoms in the ethnographic record are organized. You can see this in Cameroon today. Here's an example on the left of staple finance, where a local chief stores grain in all those storage facilities. And here another chief controls the production of exotic goods that you see here in this ritual dance. So research in the Chalcolithic started to take off in the 1950s in the northern Negev, and then in the Judean desert shortly after the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. And in the area of the Judean desert, this is before 1967, in the area that Israel controlled, they decided to do surveys of the different wadis to look for more Dead Sea Scrolls. And so they enlisted the help of the Israel Defense Forces, and they helped them, you know, with the logistics of getting into these very remote caves and so on that you see there. And here you can see the famous Israeli archaeologist Yigal Yadin. He had a fancy wadi. Nahum Avigad, another famous old Israeli professor, he got a great wadi. But they gave the wadi that they thought, they're never going to find anything on it, to a guy who only had a BA. No offense, students, but he only had a BA in archaeology, and that was this man, Pesach Baradon. But Baradon had lived with the Tamira Bedouins of the Judean desert for 3 years in the early 1930s. He knew the desert like the back of his hand. They went into one of these caves. They had to, you know, have these rope ladders going down like 40 meters or so on. And there you can see Baradon with the corncob pipe. Don't ever smoke on an archaeology site, you know, but this is the old days. So that's what they did. And here you can see the volunteers and some of the young army recruits on one of the last days of the project in the Judean desert. And Baradon said, okay, you have this huge rock at the edge of the cave. You got to like pry it out of there. And so they pry it out. And what do they find? They find this amazing treasure. It became known as the Cave of the Treasure. And here you can see wrapped in a mat are these amazing copper objects like mace heads, copper standards, you know, which are symbols of rank and power. And there are even some copper crowns in there. And these are the original black and white images. And then this is what it looks like. And if you go to the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, you've probably seen this stuff. They have a massive display. There's even ivory tusks from elephant and hippos. You see, these are the ivory tusks with holes that have been drilled in them. And amazing their works. There are over 420 of them. And they're made of an alloyed copper, you know, like an arsenical copper, not pure copper. And here's a detail of one. And this just shows you a map of all the cave sites that have Chalcolithic sites have been found near the Dead Sea, overlooking the Dead Sea. And there's over 90 of them. And these caves were reinvestigated by Uri Davidovich, who's a young professor now at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And there's Uri going down into another cave called the Cave of Hor. This is a young person's work. We can't do this, Larry. You know, we're past this. And look, even Uri got tired. You can see him relaxing here after trying to get into the cave. But the idea is that when the Chalcolithic period, when all these sites that you're going to see shortly in the northern Negev collapsed, people became refugees and they sought refuge in these caves. And perhaps the Cave of the Treasure, those copper objects, were gathered together and buried in the cave. Okay, so there's a package, what I like to call a package of socioeconomic changes that mark the Chalcolithic and make it totally different from the preceding Neolithic period and all the Paleolithic periods when we had different levels of hunter-gatherers. And one of those first, and here you can see, like, these are like areas where you have traditions of Chalcolithic culture in the Sinai, in the Negev, in Samaria, in the Golan Heights. And the material culture is quite different in all these regions in the southern Levant, in an area that's probably like as big as California, something like that. Here in the Golan Heights, in the area of Israel and Syria, you see this woman, Claire Epstein, who was an archaeologist that worked with the Israel Antiquities Authority. They'd never give her a Jeep. So when this is shortly after Israel conquered the Golan Heights in the Six-Day War, she just hitchhiked all over the place, and she discovered the amazing Chalcolithic village sites in the Golan. And each of those sites had like these amazing pillar figures about this big, carved out of basalt. But every home, every building had one of those. So it's kind of a very localized cult. But when Jean Perrault started to excavate in the 1950s around the city of Beersheba that you see up there, he found at the site of Bir Safadi and Abu Matar these beautiful, well, I think they're beautiful, ivory figurines that are about this tall. They're amazing. And they all have these anthropomorphic features. And for lack of a better word, they call them Pinocchio figurines. I wonder why, you know. But what's interesting, when in our early excavations at Sheikh Mim, like 1979, 1980, we found one of those identical to the ivory figurines, but made of basalt, okay? And so what we see along the Wadi Beersheba, we have the same kind of like ideological system or ritual system operating in all these villages along the Wadi. Another interesting thing that happens in the Chalcolithic is what we call the secondary products revolution. This was an idea from a British archaeologist by the name of Andrew Sherritt. And you know, you have to think during the Neolithic period, when people were raising animals, you know, herd animals like sheep and goat, they were doing it just for the meat, and then and then slaughtering the animals. But by the Chalcolithic, they started to develop sophisticated herding strategies to exploit the secondary products of these animals, like milk and wool and hair, and traction, so that you could use cows to pull a plow, that sort of thing. That was all new. That's why we call it a revolution. And you can see like these churn, that's a Chalcolithic churn for making yogurt or cheese at the top. And also we have fruit, like dates came online during they were domesticated very late during the Chalcolithic, and olives, domesticated olives came together in the Chalcolithic period. So the beginnings of the Mediterranean diet, if you like, happens in the Chalcolithic. And here's a picture of a Bedouin woman in Tel Sheva, which is a Bedouin town on the edge of the modern city of Beersheba. And we visited them one day and saw her using a skin churn to make yogurt, you see? So it's just like the ceramic ones that I showed you. And a friend of mine was in southeast Turkey and took this picture in a Kurdish village of these women who were also making ceramic churns. I don't know if you have one in your collection, but that would be awesome if you did. But basically, you would just tie ropes around the ends of this churn and hang it from the rafters and then move it back and forth, and you would make cheese. This is called jamid in Arabic, and you let it dry out on the top of your tent as a kind of ball, and then you can put it in your saddlebag. You can go for 5 years, but believe me, it's not as tasty as Parmesan. I'm just saying, that's my personal view. But I've had a lot of really nice mansafs, you know, the big Bedouin feasts with jamid. And then the ground loom for weaving also comes online during the Chalcolithic period. And here's an example of a Bedouin, also in Tel Sheva, a Bedouin woman with weaving a rug in this area. Another new development are the earliest temples. Now, temples, of course, in different parts of the Middle East evolved even earlier, but in the southern Levant, the first temple structures occur in the Chalcolithic, and we only know of 3 of them. There's one at Talelat Gasul that I mentioned earlier at the northeast end of the Dead Sea at the top of the picture. Another one at Ein Gedi in the Judean desert in Israel. And here you can see the Ein Gedi spring. And that's the detail of the excavator, David Ushishkin, at this little entryway to the temple. And then at Gasul, they discovered this amazing mural that's about 15 by 10 feet in size, you know, showing maybe there's a procession or something connected with a temple there. And in our own excavations, I was fortunate to excavate the 3rd known Chalcolithic temple at a site called Gilat. And this is the book, big one that we published. And Gilat is about 18 kilometers north of Shikmin. Here's Shikmin. Gilat is 18 kilometers north of that. And look what we found. In the Holy of Holies of the temple, we found a what's now called the Gilat ram and the Gilat woman. And she looks like she's sitting, some archaeologists say she's sitting on a birthing stool. What does she have on her head? What do you folks think? A churn, exactly. And so the ram, a symbol of virility, has 3 what we think are cornet, you know, ice cream shaped vessels stuck in its back like this. And so these are also emblematic of the secondary products revolution here. There are also these exotic figurines, they call them violin-shaped figurines because it looks like a violin or a human figure, as you see here. The largest number known have been discovered at Gilat. And we even think that they produced them there and they were exchanged for goods and services when people came to the temple. We also found these long pottery vessels. This is broken in 2 that you see here, like a kind of amphora, which, for lack of a better word, we were digging during the first Gulf War, so we called them torpedo vessels. It stuck. And when we did chemical analyses of these vessels, we found that they contained evidence of olive oil, and petrographic analysis showed that these vessels were manufactured in 9 different places in the southern Levant, like from Jordan, the West Bank, the northern Negev, but yet they all contained evidence of olive oil, and they were traded in to Gilat. Quite remarkable. And so one way to conceptualize, you know, religion at this time is through this book called The Treasures of Darkness by Thorkid Jakobsen. Was he one of your teachers? amazing. Well, you're lucky to have Larry. And Jakobsen was like an amazing scholar. So he thought of these fourth and late fifth millennium gods as the gods of providers and or dying gods of fertility. By the third millennium, in the early Bronze Age, the gods are presented as rulers, because this is when we get the beginnings of urbanism and so on. So this is a very powerful metaphor. And another new thing in the Chalcolithic are the first regional cemeteries. And this map shows all over the region, we have cemetery sites distinct from village sites, actually. You know, in the Neolithic, people buried their dead mostly in their own houses under the floors. Now we have cemeteries that mark territoriality, that sort of thing. And there you can see some cemeteries, Chalcolithic cemetery remains from Palmachim on the Israeli coast. As part of my PhD, I did a archaeological survey of the Wadi Beersheba and the Wadi Gaza. Imagine, I mean, this was 120 kilometers long. I did it on my bicycle because I was really poor, and that's all I could afford. And went all the way to Gaza. I mean, there was no fence, there were no problems at all. It's hard to imagine. But in any case, by doing a regional survey, we could understand, you know, the distribution of archaeological sites and how that relates to the social organization of the people. And after I got a few £100 sterling, I got this minivan, a Fiat minivan, and my girlfriend, Alina, who's now my wife, we drove in 1979 from England to Israel, and then the car made it, and we used it for our surveys, which you see there. And here's the Wadi Beersheba, a model of it. And what we discovered was that for the first time in the archaeological record of the Southern Levant was evidence of large village centers surrounded by little satellite sites. And there were like 4 of these clusters around Beersheba at Bir Safadi, and then around Shikmim, and so on. And so this 2-tier settlement hierarchy is sort of the fingerprint of a chiefdom organization. We know this from anthropology around the world. By 1982, I got my first grant from the National Geographic Society. Professor William Deaver had been my professor, and he came to visit us in Beersheba, and he said, you should apply for National Geographic. This is how you do it. And he was great. He showed me how to do it. I got my grant, and then off we went. I borrowed a lot of equipment, and then we would do this like for years. We would go every fall during the Jewish holidays, because Shikmim is actually located in the middle of an Israeli army firing zone. And so you got to go during the holidays when they don't practice. And here you can see an aerial view of our excavations, the village, and then a couple of big trenches. Here are some soldiers who came to visit, and that's me on the right, very slim, young. And here's later on our children, our 2 boys, Ben and Gil, having a bath in the field, and we would live in these army tents. And the dog, I have to show a picture of Sandy, and then trying to get the kids to study out there. And some other people you might know, Yuval Gorin, who's now a very well-known professor of archaeometry at Ben Gurion University. He was my student there. Professor Augustin Hull, he was a research associate of mine, and I invited him. He invited me to work in Cameroon. We did a lot of work together. And this just shows you what it's like on the dig. I even got the Beersheba Sinfonietta, some of their players, to come out and do a concert for our students. So here you can see them playing in these old Ottoman abandoned ruins. And this was our archaeozoologist, Dr. Caroline Grigson, who is still a collaborator. And now Professor Paul Goldberg. Everybody's retired now, but here he is young. And what was interesting, when we made these deep sections, we started to find, for the first time, I mean, from 1979 to 1986, we never knew there were any underground dwellings here at Shikmin, but we started to see them in outline in these trench excavations. And here you can see at the end of one of our projects, the entrance to one of these underground systems. And here we removed the roof off of these because when you excavate them, they're dug into the hard packed lucial sediment, this kind of wind-blown sediment that's compacted. And the Chalcolithic people were master engineers. I mean, they knew how to mine and they knew how to create underground dwellings, almost like a human ant farm. Did anybody ever have an ant farm as a kid? Raise your hand. Like a lot of people. Okay, so imagine being able to crawl through those. And here you can see one of the buildings there. And this is with some of our Palestinian workers that we employed. And then the fellow on the left is Yoav Arbel, who's now a senior archaeologist with the Israel Antiquities Authority. Here you can see a cross section. This is about 25 feet underground. So you have these tunnels and underground rooms. Why? And then here's a National Geographic reconstruction of people underground having a little meeting, and then some of the tunnels that lead to other rooms where we found lots of evidence of storage facilities. And these were the last season of our work was 1993. So this is all pre-digital archaeology. And we used car batteries with small lights to illuminate these tunnels. And I honestly don't think my university would have allowed us to dig these if they knew about it today, because of OSHA, about OSHA and all the rules. But I was never good at following rules in my career. That's why it's good I retired. And here is Yoav popping up out of one of these tunnels inside a large underground room. So there were two components. There was the open air village, which you see the foundations of. So imagine, mud brick walls, a superstructure going around all of this. A very well-planned village, cardinally oriented, and then the underground component. And so, we always would dig in October, November, and sometimes you get a flood in the Wadi. It looks like the Mississippi River here, this is like 300 meters across at this point, and it's about 2 meters deep. We almost lost a few of our students. I told them never to go in the Wadi when it rained, but do the students listen? No, they don't always listen. And that's a reconstruction of what the open air village would have looked like. And then back in the day, we did some innovative work with geophysics. I teamed up with a young professor, Alan Witten, from the University of Oklahoma in Norman, Oklahoma. And we did this project using a method that he developed called geophysical diffraction tomography. And how many people saw the movie Jurassic Park? Remember? That's the system they use in the movie, and it was based on Alan's work. And basically what they would do is they would put like geophones, microphones, or hydrophones in like a column of water in the ground, and then you need a sound source. So in the movie, and this is the way they do it in America, you have an 8-gauge shotgun attached to a little roller, and then you fire that shotgun off, it makes a sound, and you record the sound waves. Well, you can't take one of those through Israeli customs. I'm just saying. So we had to use a sledgehammer. And but the imaging we got, we used a computer program called Earth Vision. I don't even know if it still exists, but you could pull out data in our 5 by 5 meter grid, and then you can keep enhancing it and modeling it. And like here, we could see, oh, there's a tunnel there, okay? And so we did a ground truth test, meaning excavate right on top of that area. And this young woman is sitting in the underground room that we imaged, and then the tunnel is right above her head. So it's fantastic. And this view is like looking up through that tunnel at the grid strings of our excavation unit. And then if we want to see what is under that whole hill, because we knew we had those underground houses in the main old excavation area, but we didn't know how far it extended. And so that's why we used the geophysics like 300 meters from the main excavation. And look, it's honeycombed with underground rooms and tunnels. So it's going all over the place there. And in some of these places we found ivory. This is from a hippo, very much like the Cave of the Treasure that I showed you. We found copper mace heads with alloyed copper that you see there, just like the Cave of the Treasure. But ours was totally corroded, so we decided to just, what do archaeologists do with ugly artifacts? They cut them up and then open it up. It looks like a Tootsie Pop, but instead of chocolate in the middle, you've got glauconitic chalk from the Dead Sea area surrounded by this copper alloy. Amazing, amazing stuff, just like the Cave of the Treasure. And that's a reconstruction of some people smelting copper in the village at Shikmin. Okay, so I'm going to close the lecture by suggesting that, if you look at the distribution of sites in the whole of the southern Levant with actual evidence of smelting copper, heating it up and extracting it from the copper ore, the only place you find that is in the Beersheba Valley. So we suggest that the Beersheba Valley Chalcolithic people had a monopoly on copper production. And then where'd the copper come from? Chemical analysis showed it came from the Fainan region of southern Jordan. And so in 1997, the Israelis found an amazing cave in the Judean desert where they found some interesting chalcolithic material. They called it the Cave of the Warrior. And they invited me to go to Washington to give them a 2-day seminar on the Chalcolithic period. And I explained to them that when it came to metallurgy, the Chalcolithic people of Beersheba, based on the chemical analysis, they went to Fainan, they mined the copper, they put it on donkeys, they carried it across the Negev, the wilderness of Zin, to the Beersheba Valley. And so at the National Geographic, they said, well, why don't you do it? And I said, do what? And they said, just reconstruct the whole thing. And I said, with the donkeys? They said, yes. And I said, will you pay for it? And they said, yes. And so we decided to do it. This was 2 years after the peace treaty between Israel and Jordan, and it was a glory days. I sent a fax to Dr. Mohammed Najjar, who was then the director of excavations and surveys at the Department of Antiquities in Jordan. Immediately, I said, will you come with me on I never met him. Will you come on a donkey caravan and we're going to do all this? He wrote me back immediately, yes, I'll join you. And then this German archaeometallurgist, Professor Andreas Hauptmann, who did the pioneer archaeometallurgical work in this area, I wanted him, because we were going to start getting into his research area, sent him a fax. Will you join us? Yes, he'll join us. So we did the first and only Israeli, Jordanian, American, German project, archaeology project in the southern Levant. And here you can see, this is a false color view of Fainan. And then Dana is this village up at the top. That's our excavation camp that we started to use in later years. But at the top of the Wadi Fainan, this tributary called the Wadi Dana, is this beautiful village called Dana, which is part of the Jordanian natural, what is it called? I'm just blanking out. The Donna Reserve. It's the biosphere. Yeah, we're almost done. And so this is the copper ore district. If you know where to look, if you understand the geology, you know where the copper is. And there are two main units of copper in our region. This one, the Dolomite Shale, has been very intensively excavated. So we showed up in Fainan in Dana in 1997. I had an Israeli Bedouin driver with his vehicle. We brought it from the Negev. Everybody, all the Bedouins there, they thought, this guy's Jewish. he's not a Bedouin, but he was a solid Bedouin. And so I rented donkeys. And so for those of you that know, when you do deals in the Middle East, you don't always get what you think you're going to get. I rented 10 donkeys. I thought I was going to get one guy to look after it. No, I got 10 Bedouins, 10 donkeys. And soon we had like a very kind of biblical-like scene moving across the landscape. And here you can see pulling the donkeys. And here the walls of the Wadi Fainan with our research team down here with the donkey caravan. And then we, the copper ore, the malachite, it just jumps out at you. It's so beautiful in the wadi. And there it is. So it's very easy to extract. We used stone axes for a while, but we didn't have a lot of time. So then we got the mining hammers out, loaded up our saddlebags like that. And then here you can see the young Dr. Mohammed Najjar leading us to the border crossing area between Jordan and Israel. We had to get the Jordanian army to work with the Israeli army, and it was great. And we crossed over. The Jordanian side, they didn't really care about stamps and stuff, but on the Israeli side, as soon as we got on the other side, they had a new stamp for a wadi crossing in the middle of nowhere, but they stamped our passports. We went through the wilderness of Zin that you might know from the Bible. Here you can see it. And then here is the big valley portion of the wadi. And then we ended up 7 days later at Shikmim, and we just picked up groundstone mortars and pestles and so on, and ground up the malachite that you see here. And then Andreas had brought these blow tubes, if you like, with ceramic heads from his lab in Bochum, Germany. And we used these blow pipes to try to smelt the copper ore. So we're not smoking something weird here. We're actually trying to smelt copper. And Andreas, being German, he said, okay, everybody blow, so we're blow, we do the, all at the same time. We did it for like an hour. It didn't work. So I said, well, how about like, Andreas, you blow, Mohammed blows, and then I blow, and we just, and that worked, And here you can see the experiment, and that's the crucible there with the coal. And this is smelting at night. And then there it is. We succeeded in smelting copper. And what we discovered is that it takes about an hour to extract 10 grams of copper. So if you need 250 grams of copper for a small axe, that's a lot of work that goes into it. And people are still using stone axes at this time. So we're even skeptical that these, what we think are utilitarian tools, they're probably very valued items here. So it's something to think about. So that basically shows us that those two economic drivers, of a wealth-based system and one based on food, on the control of food stuff, work together to promote this new social organization in the history of the Southern Levant. And once they passed that threshold, there was no going back. Thank you very much.
So I think we may have some questions. I know that we do from some Zoom attendees. Do you want to read those first here? Okay.
So I have two questions that came in from Zoom. The first question is, can you please speak to the seeming prevalence of female iconography and the anthropomorphized artifacts of the time and region? That is, I only noticed one figurine with male characteristics among the images that you shared during your presentation.
Okay, that's a really good question about the gender and the iconography in the assemblage. And I can't say anything about the control of the society. Like, I can't really say if there was a matriarchal society at that time. But certainly, there's a prevalence of violin-shaped figurines, and we think they represent the female body, okay, with the large hips and so on. And some of them do have breasts. And so the female ideal was certainly very important to them. And but how it worked out in terms of social organization and so on, we don't know. Yeah.
Second one from Zoom, and then anybody else?
Perfect. So the second question is, what sort of ventilation was used in the underground houses? Assuming fire was used for light, wouldn't those inside have had issues with smoke inhalation if there wasn't adequate ventilation?
That's a really good question about ventilation in the underground systems. And we don't really know, we have different theories about what they were used for. One is storage of food stuff, like grain and so on. If that's the case, then you're not going to go down there very often. We did not actually find evidence of fire hearths down there in the ones that we excavated. And in many cases, there were like air holes that led to the surface in some of them. Usually, shafts that would go down, and that would serve as a way of getting air into them. Yeah.
Other questions? Raise your hand, and I will bring the microphone to you.
I just had a question. And you were just speaking about the violin-shaped figurines, and I was wondering if in your research you had noticed any connection between the Southern Levant at this point in the Chalcolithic period and the Aegean, because I know the violin figurines are also very pervasive in the Cycladic culture that was thriving around the same time.
Yeah, that's a good question also. If you look at the radiocarbon chronologies of the Southern Levant versus Greece, they occur much earlier in places like Israel than they do in the Aegean. The earliest examples of those like Cycladic figurines, indeed they really look like violin figures, but the more that the Aegean ones develop through the Bronze Age in Greece, they start to lose that one-to-one sort of parallel between the Levant and Greece. But my Greek colleagues who work in Greek prehistory, some of them do think that the idea arrived in Greece through some kind of maritime traffic to the Aegean from the Southern Levant. And that's not so far stretched, because nowadays the more ancient DNA work that's done, the more we understand the connectivity of peoples and cultures throughout the ancient Mediterranean world on a level that we didn't fathom before. They're like in anthropological theory has gone through different stages, from the early 19th century diffusionists who believed like all cultural developments could be explained by saying it diffused from Egypt, all the way around the world, even to pyramids in the New World. Then in the 1970s and the 80s, people threw out those kind of models, which some of them were really, went a little too far, and said, we can explain everything through local development. We can look locally without needing to talk about how might connections between Israel, Palestine, and say Central Asia, Azerbaijan, where we know that some of the copper came from for the alloys, forget all that stuff. Well, now, in the last decade, with advances in ancient DNA, we're seeing this, that people were mating, across wide parts of the world. So they were connected. So we can't totally throw those ideas out now. And that's a great area of future research. And you would enjoy the beach in Greece if you do that.
Anyone else? I have a quick question for you.
Sure.
So copper production, how would you compare southern Jordan, the Fenan, Wadi Fenan, with Cyprus, which is copper? How would you compare those, and would you suggest that the same sort of social dynamics are at work in both places?
Yeah, it depends on the period, right? Because we don't have a lot of evidence in Cyprus for the really early phases of copper production. And in fact, I don't think that's an area that needs to be investigated. Like, how did copper production emerge on the island of Cyprus? That's a question we can answer in the southern Levant, but we can't do it there. But when it comes to later periods, like in the late Bronze Age, we know that copper production was on an industrial scale, probably the largest scale of any place on the planet was taking place there from 1600 to, say, 1200 BC. And in Fenan, in those periods, in late Bronze Age, it's just starting to ramp up. And it's only after the collapse of late Bronze Age civilizations around 1200 BC, around the Eastern Mediterranean, when the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, and New Kingdom Egypt collapse, that the copper industry in Cyprus also took a blow. And that created like a vacuum, a technological vacuum that was filled by the people of Fenan and the Wadi Araba. We call them the Edomites, who evolved in that area, taking advantage of that power vacuum. Yeah. Oh, we got another one.
I'm going to come around.
Tom, great lecture. I really appreciate it. In Iron Age, some temples like at Toulouse, I see some evidences that metal work took place in the precinct inside the temple. I don't know when actually really began. Do you see any evidence in Chalcolithic or early Bronze, those times, that the metals kind of a work start to move or monopolized by the temple or cultic authorities?
That's a great question. The relationship between metalworking and ritual. And I think that if somebody was a chief, and we know this from anthropological literature, they had other roles to play in the society, besides just the control of political power. And with regard to Chalcolithic metallurgy, it takes place near what we would call chiefly residences. So, I don't think in the Chalcolithic temples that we know of from the southern Levant, like at Telalat Gasul and Ein Gedi and Gilat, there's no metallurgy linked to the ritual loci of those places. At Gilat, there's no evidence of metal production at all, and yet it's contemporary with the Wadi Beersheba culture. So I don't think we can really answer that. Yeah.
Oh, who is? Oh, Larry, here you are.
I just thought that I would mention another interesting connection that you might not be aware of. You mentioned Jean Perrault and his research. I don't know if you realize that his headquarters was in the basement of the Adventist headquarters in Jerusalem, a facility that was purchased by my wife's grandfather in the 30s.
I did not know that.
So isn't that an interesting? You have another Adventist connection to your
I
research.
got it again. I got lots of them. I ate dinner at Jean Perrault's apartment with him once, but he didn't say. No, he didn't say this place is owned by the Adventists, you know. But thank you for pointing that out. That's amazing.
Let's thank Dr. Levy again for a wonderful lecture. It was a terrific lecture, and storytelling is your thing. Well, you have to tell stories. So thank you so much. Quick reminder: there is a reception, Valentine's Day themed, at the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology. It's just a short walk, or if you want to drive your car, drive it up into campus to the administration building parking lot, drive straight through and just keep going in that direction, and you will get to the center. Please join us, and Tom will be happy to tell some more stories. Okay? Thank you for coming.
They're all true, by the way.